Hello, everyone. Dr. Ames here. This time I'd like to talk to you about some of the demographics regarding older persons and generally about aging in America. Uh, as our author points out, in about 1860, persons 65 and older wielded tremendous economic power and political power as well. And even though at that time they were only 3% of the population, Uh, but it was a situation where older persons, in general, their knowledge was valued and their experience was valued and indeed relied upon by society. But between 1860 and 1920, America really did change. All the fruits of the Industrial Revolution were coming to bear with new manufacturing techniques and the rise of modern factories and urban jobs and so forth. And the country really was making a shift from agriculture to industry. And what this meant was that there was a need for younger, stronger workers to keep up with the demanding pace of the physical work in these factories, because the physical side of this was quite strong in the early days of factory work. There were really intense physical demands quite often. And so employers over time came to depend on and demand these younger workers. We saw that over time, fewer older persons were able to support themselves. They could no longer rely on the family staying on the farm and building their economic and political power that way over time. Uh, that way of living was rapidly becoming a thing of the past. And so they couldn't support themselves in the new economies that were developing. They couldn't be economically productive in the new labor market because manufacturers and companies in general were looking for younger men mainly. So older workers came to be at a disadvantage, both physically and as time progressed, increasingly at a technological disadvantage in the workplace because they weren't learning these new skills and so forth. So remember at this time, if you worked for a company, there were no meaningful pension plans, there was no retirement, there was no 401k, there was no minimum wage or set hourly work week, and there were no safety or labor laws to speak of at all. No mandated employer provided support. And so, what really happened to older persons in America was by the 1930s, to be old in America was often to meant that you would have a life of poverty and loneliness and ageism. And ageism, of course, is discrimination against older people. And so, as the population began to move to the cities where the jobs began, older people did tend to not only not be able to support themselves, but they became isolated. And certainly they had lost the influence that they were deferred to in previous times. So they were less influential with younger generations. And even when Social Security came around in the 1930s, it was always the plan on the creators of that whole program that most people would certainly die before getting benefits, and that's exactly what happened to make it financially workable over time, and is really part of the problem today because people are simply living longer. So when we talk about how old is old, there are different definitions depending on the source. And so if we look at the Americans with Disabilities and Employment Act, um, it really says that discriminating against persons 40 years of age and older is against the law. But if we look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, all their research indicates 55 is the age when certain workplace problems with older workers begin to be noticed. Maybe that they have a skills obsolescence, that the things they're doing are no longer quite as valid. Uh, it's harder for them to get the training, and it's harder for them certainly to get rehired. But, and as well, if we look at the census, the age of being old is looked at as 65. Um, if we look at gerontologists, those medical doctors who are really concerned with older persons, they have a very interesting definition. They say that old people can be divided up into two categories. The young old. The young old are 65 to 75 years old, and the old are older than 75. So if we look at some current demographics today about older persons in America, we find that people over 65 are about 13% of the population, so about 40 million or so. With the overall US population growing about 10%, this group is growing at about 15%. That simply means people are living longer. Um, as the table below shows, people 65 and over went from 1 in 25 for every 3 million to a projected 1 in 5 for every 88 million in 2050. And you can see that in 2010 it was 13%, 1 in 7, which is a considerable increase. So it simply reflects that people do live a little bit longer than they used to. Today, the average American lifespan is 78, but if we look back to 1900, it was 47. So this is also for Euro-Americans. If we look at the various ethnicities, Euro-American women live the longest to 80. African-American men live the shortest at about 45 years of age. Of the 65 plus years old group, there are only 74 men for every 100 women. So that tells us that men are dying at an earlier age than women. Of the 85 plus age or older group, there are only 46 men for every 100 women. Men die younger, so older women are often alone. Consequently, in today's society, poverty is always a concern for these older women. And we're all different, of course. Our lifespan is affected by genetics and environment and lifestyle and income and so forth. And many of these factors become out of our control as individuals. We look at Asian Americans and Latino Americans. They have 8% of their populations who are 65 years of age or older. If we look at African Americans and Native Americans, they have about 6%, about 65 or older. So these are fairly close. If we look at where older people in the United States live, um, they live in the South, followed by the Midwest and the West, with the smallest proportion of people living 65 years of age and older in the Northeast. And the West, of course, has had the fastest growth rate of 65 plus persons at 24%. So it's not Florida, it's California when it comes to states that has the most older people, followed by Florida and then New York. And then a final few statistics for you. According to the 2010 census, 56% of people 65 years of age and older are married. 66% of those people live with their spouse or other relatives, and 27% do live alone. And of those, 5% live in group quarters and 2% live with other people who are not relatives. Okay, folks, that's something to think about for this time. I'll talk to you again soon.